Okay, so continuing on, we're going to get with the skeletal system now. And so for this video, we're going to be kind of just focusing on just an overview of the skeletal system. So just a bit of review. If you've recently taken anatomy, this may feel really familiar, but if it's been a while, this will be a good way for you to kind of revisit this particular topic. So we're going to talk about the physiological functions of bone, we're going to talk about the structures of bone in general, and then talk about some different types, like compact versus spongy, and then get into the composition of bone in this particular video. So just remember that the skeletal system is going to include the bone and the connective tissues that are part of the joints. So this is going to include the bones. It's also going to include cartilages, ligaments, right? Things that are going to kind of be part of holding bones in place and articulating one bone to another. The whole point of the skeletal system is to help provide support, right? It's a scaffolding for our body. It also gives protection, so think like your ribs, your skull, protecting these very vital organs that are softer and kind of prone to damage if they have nothing to cover them. It's also going to provide the scaffolding for the muscles so that we can move. But in addition to that, it will also help us with blood cell production and the storage of lipids and minerals. So if we look at the physiological functions, we're kind of looking at those last ones that I mentioned on the slide before. We have the support. Yes, we're attachment sites for movement. But the other big ones are mineral banking, so things like calcium, iron, magnesium, phosphorus, those types of things that we need to keep in check and in balance. We can actually bank them up, we can store them in bone, and then release them as needed. Hematopoiesis, which is just the formation of blood cells, so all of the blood cells are going to be produced in the red bone marrow. And then energy storage in the middle, right? In that medullary cavity inside of like a long bone, for example, we see yellow bone marrow, and that's going to help store triglycerides. So let's take a look at our stereotypical long bone, right? So the stereotypical or a prototypic example is the long bone, which has these key structures. I'm going to go very quick in this because, again, you can take the time if you need to. If not, this is just to remember. The diaphysis, which is the shaft of the bone, the epiphyses, which are the ends, like the rounded-ish ends of the long bone. The metaphysis is going to be kind of where things narrow in from the rounded out part towards the shaft, so it's in between the epiphysis and diaphysis. Articular cartilage, which is going to be the cartilage that will cover the bone where that bone will be part of a joint, so that we can reduce the friction. We prevent bone grinding on bone, and it can help act kind of like a shock absorber. The periosteum is a covering over the surface of the entire bone. This is going to have cells that help form bone, that promote bone growth, and help with the repair of fractures. The endosteum is the inner, right, the inner lining. So the periosteum is the outer covering. The endosteum is the inner covering of the medullary cavity, which the medullary cavity is this opening. Sometimes you may see this being called the marrow cavity because we have yellow marrow in there. And then the endosteum, right, just lining that medullary, which I now realize I have on there twice, but that's okay, that's all right. But so you should be able to recognize these, right, because this should not be anything new. We should be somewhat familiar with these pieces. And if we take a little closer look, right, we can see that there's two different types of bone tissues. We have the compact bone, which is what you probably think of when you think of bone. You're thinking of like something very solid. And that's going to be very dense. It's going to typically be part of the shaft of a long bone. And then the spongy bone is that web, that spongy look. I mean, it's called spongy bone for a reason, right? Sometimes it's called trabecular or cancellous bone or cancellous bone. I'm just going to call it spongy bone because that's what you've probably learned it as, and we'll just keep that trend. This helps with being more lightweight, so we're not as heavy. And this is also going to be where all those red blood cells, where all those white blood cells, right, platelets and all that, all those blood cells are produced. No matter what bone you're looking at, you're going to see both types, right? Generally speaking, the compact bone will be on the outer sides, and the spongy bone is going to be a bit further in. So let's take a look at compact bone. So the compact bone is nice and dense and strong, and that means it's going to be great for bearing like weight and resisting stress from movement, right? So it's super dense. That helps us basically handle the load of moving around, right? Gravity, your own body weight, right? The stress of moving into a different position. Now, the way compact bone is organized is into a subunit we call the osteon. Sometimes you'll see this called the functional unit of bone, right? Or the main unit of bone. It's not, an osteon is not a bone cell though, right? There are bone cells within this. This is the unit of bone, including the cells and the matrix. If we look at the things we see in a standard osteon, so here is a single osteon right here. We have a central canal, sometimes called a Haversian canal. I'll just say central for you guys. That's going to be right there in the middle. And then we see there's like these rings, almost like rings of a tree. And then little lines kind of connecting us, right? And so each of these rings is called a lamella, right? Or a lamellae if you're talking about more than one. And then we see these little lines, right? These are the canaliculi, the little channels that run from that central canal out and around. The osteocytes are here in blue. And then there you see that they're always in like this little white chamber, and that's called a lacuna. So I like to remember it for myself, I say that bone cells they live in Lacuna Beach. They live in a Lacuna Beach house, right? They have a little house for themselves. These osteons line up along stress lines, which can change as stresses change when bone gets remodeled as people grow and develop. But this is going to give us that strength. So not only are we dense, but we're also arranging ourselves in a way that will help us avoid breaks. Now the spongy bone, right, does not have the same density. It is more of a lattice-like structure. So you saw before it looked like a sponge. This helps kind of lighten the weight of the bone so we're not so heavy. And rather than being arranged in osteons, we're arranging in what are called trabeculae or trabeculi. And so we see it's kind of similar, right? It's kind of similar, but there's, it doesn't have that central canal. It doesn't have some of the other things that the osteon do. And then you'll notice, we saw this on the other one, but I didn't point out, but we see them in both, is the osteoblast and the osteoclast. We'll talk more about those ones in a little bit when we talk about bone formation and remodeling. So just kind of keep those in your head because these are ones we will be revisiting and talking about a little bit more. So if we look at how things kind of go all together, right? Here's our osteons. You see how they're concentrically, the concentric circles all next to each other. We see the periosteum covering everything. We see as we move towards the medullary cavity that we turn into spongy bone, right? And so we see that we kind of make these transitions, right? From an outer covering to this dense compact bone to this lighter spongy bone. If you need to, you can pause here to look at everything. But again, this should be a good amount of review, so I'm not going to spend too much time. So let's talk about when things go wrong. So we mentioned that the bones can help with mineral storage, especially things like calcium and whatnot. But if someone has issues, right, with that, maybe they are not taking in enough nutrients, or they're getting older, or they have a genetic risk factor to this, we can see what we call demineralization of the bone, which, if it occurs in excess, will develop into what's called osteoporosis. Basically, the trabeculae and the spongy bone become thin, which means the bones get more brittle, they break easier. So this person, right, that has osteoporosis, here's their normal spongy bone, and then here it is with the osteoporosis. You see like literally pores, right? Like openings, like holes developing. Like all these little notches and grooves suddenly become these wide gaping openings. And that's really problematic because again, this will contribute to breaks. And so while we usually see this in older people, something to consider is that fractures, especially in like the hip, lower life expectancy significantly in those who are already elderly. And so osteoporosis increases the risk of a break, which could then overall mean this person could see a dramatic drop in life expectancy if they were to fall. So if we look at what bone is actually made of, bone, like the other connective tissues, is made up of two components. The cellular component, which are the actual cells, and the matrix, right? The compounds, the substance that the cells are suspended in. When it comes to bone, we have a solid matrix, right? And we're going to take a look at some of those things, like some of the tissues, the collagen fibrins that are found there, polysaccharides that are found there, as well as minerals like the calcium phosphate, the hydroxyapatite that are found in the matrix. And then with the cells, we have the osteoblasts, the osteoclasts, and the osteocytes. So if we take a peek, this is kind of this is going to be a little bit newer. We have in the ECM, again, most of bone is acellular, meaning the matrix does not have a lot of cells throughout it. It's the cells are kind of few and far between. And there's two real parts to the ECM here. We have the organic side and then the inorganic side, or the mineral side. So in the organic side, we're looking at collagen fibers. This gives us some elasticity so that we have some bending ability, so that we're not just, I mean, we're dense and we're tough, but we're not so rigid that anything could just snap us, right? There's a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of ability to bend, right? Kind of like a tree. Think about like a tree in the wind, right? A tree is very solid, it's very sturdy, but it can kind of sway and bend with the wind if needed. So the collagen fibers are kind of giving us that function. And then the hydroxyapatite salts, right? This is the mineral side of things. You don't need to memorize the calcium 10, phosphate 6, hydroxy 2. Like, you don't need to remember that. But the name hydroxyapatite, sure. So hydroxyapatite is the most of the mineral content, and this gives us some compressional strength. So when we get compressed, right, pushed down on. And so we find on the surface, too, we have the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, which are going to be in control of the buildup and tear down of bone, because we're constantly going through a process of remodeling this bone, of breaking it down, building it up, breaking it down and building it up. Another condition that can develop is osteogenesis imperfecta. This is a genetic disorder that someone is born with, and it creates bones that are extremely weak. Usually, like, I mean, anything can really cause this. I mean, someone could sneeze and break a bone with osteogenesis imperfecta. And so a person with this condition could break their bones hundreds of times over their lifetime. There's a defect in the type 1 collagen, and so we know the collagen gives us that ability to kind of bend rather than snap. And so someone with this defect, right, one, the formation of the bone is not normal, and two, we don't get that elasticity, which means any little thing, right, can then snap that bone. This is extremely difficult to deal with sometimes, especially for a parent of a newborn with this condition, because if the condition is not known yet, it's not uncommon for the parents to, at least on the surface, if not deeper in, get accused of things like child abuse, because babies shouldn't be breaking bones. And if a baby's coming in with several broken bones or multiple broken bones over a period of time, they're obviously going to suspect that and then possibly call it in if this hasn't been determined to be the cause yet. Once this is determined to be the cause, then those fractures, those breaks become much more easily explained. But this can be really difficult, especially before a diagnosis, because with those children, the authorities may actually suspect the parents are the ones causing it. So, which is just a whole nother kind of trauma added on to the situation of having to figure out, you know, something's wrong with my child, they're breaking their bones all the time, and I'm also being accused of the one doing it when I know I'm not. So it's really, this is a really tough condition, not just for the person who has it, but also for the family, especially early on, and something to kind of keep in your head. So let's go ahead and talk about bones composition. So we have a few different types of cells. We have the osteoprogenitor cells. These are just stem cells for bone. We have the osteoblasts. Anytime you see blast, you think build. So osteo, we think bone. Blast, we think build. This is a bone building cell. They are going to build that matrix, right? Basically pull calcium from the blood to put into the bone, build up that hydroxyapatite, and build up bone more. Osteocytes are just the ones living encased in the bone matrix. They're just the bone cells doing their daily bone cell needs. And then the osteoclasts are opposite of the osteoblast. Anytime you see clast, you want to think breakdown. And so these are the ones that break bone down to release calcium from the bones. Because remember, if we're banking those minerals up, we have to have a way to release them as well. And so the osteoclasts will break down bone and release that calcium when it's needed. You may be thinking, well, breaking down bone, that sounds bad. It's not. This is actually going to be absolutely necessary for someone as they get older to be able to grow and develop healthy bones over time, which we'll get into in the next video.